Thank you everyone for attending today. This is the first in what's actually going to be a series of webinars. We're going to be doing monthly webinars, educational webinars on different aspects of our services, systems, different kinds of things. We're also going to be sending out additional fact sheets and that kind of stuff. But so this is the first one in a while that we've done. So thank you. We're going to go through our vendor payment and reimbursement process today and offer some tips and reminders about that so that people hopefully can smoothly navigate that. We'll do questions at the end. So either you could ask them during the webinar in the chat box, and then we'll address as many as we can at the end of the presentation. I'm Matt Morgan. I'm the Chief Program Officer with the ARC. I oversee our programs and services, and in this case, I oversee self-direction. So next slide, please. All right, so like I said, we're going to go through the process first, and then just to give people an idea of sort of what's happening behind the scenes when they send in a request for a vendor payment or reimbursement, and then also some tips and reminders, and then we'll do questions. And it's worth noting that we just thought it'd be interesting for people to know that the ARC accounts payable team processes on average over 900 invoices per week. So that's a lot, and that's increased dramatically recently, particularly with individual and family directed goods and services and whatnot. So our team we're working hard to make sure our processes are adapted to handling that volume of invoices. Next slide, please. So there's three sort of basic steps in our accounts payable process. The first step is just the receiving, the initial audit of invoices. The next step is what we call processing, getting into the system, and then the approval process. Next slide. So step one is receiving in that initial audit. So the vendor payment request forms are sent to the email box. Anything received by Thursday at noon is processed by the end of the next week. And then the payment is issued on the Monday after that. So the batch goes in at the end of that Friday. So it takes a little over a week for that whole process. Again, it's a rolling process, so we're receiving them and processing up until then. Mileage reimbursements are done monthly, and so there's a due date. We send out reminders about the mileage due dates, and both of those, the dates for all of those can be found on our website. We'll go through later the accounts payable calendar. So all requests are reviewed to make sure the necessary information is included, backup documentation, anything like that, and then the team also confirms that there's an approved budget line for that service, or that it's been approved in the case of individual and family directed goods and services, that they've gone through the DDA approval process for that, if it wasn't something that was already in the budget. Next slide. So the second step is entering it into the bill system for payment. That's just the name of our payment system. As a note, we need W-9s for new vendors in order to process payment. And we typically collect W-9s for most people, even if it's not a taxable thing like a reimbursement, mainly because that form just has the very basic information that we need to set up someone's account. So filling out a W-9 doesn't necessarily mean that we intend to provide you with a 1099 for taxable income. So for things like mileage reimbursements, because they're not taxable, we don't send 1099s for those. And then, like we talked about, the payments are processed in accordance with the calendar. Next step. So final process, the approval process. There's a final review there. We review all the documentation and then release the payment. And that system sends everything. So there's our payroll system is separate from our bill payment system. And so by default, the bill system that sends things via live paper check. you can request direct deposit, but again, it's worth noting that even if an employee is set up for direct deposit through Paycom, it doesn't necessarily mean they're set up in bill to process like a mileage reimbursement. So if you are getting paper checks for something like mileage reimbursement, you could do a customer service ticket through Zendesk to request that your direct deposit information be entered in there. We try to, as we set up new employees now, we try to enter them in both systems, but they're not tied together. So it's not inherent that you would receive direct deposit through that system. Next slide. So I'm just going to go through some tips and reminders. Invoices or vendor payment requests, and we call them VPRs, so I apologize if I use the acronym. The forms need to list the specific services performed. So as an example, a vendor might be providing day habilitation or community development services, but what the vendor calls that might be different, and it might not be immediately obvious to our team. So if it comes through and it just says, fun day services, as the service, we would need to know whether that's CDS or day habilitation, and to make sure it conforms to the person's budget line. Same with training. Things are coming through for training that's not always clear. Other types of reimbursements for health, like health insurance, those kinds of things. So it just needs to be really clear which service it is, and so that we can tie it back to the budget line, make sure it gets processed timely. Otherwise, we'll be asking questions about that, and there can be some back and forth with that. Services also need to be within DEA's guidelines. So just make sure that if there's a limitation on a service like respite, there's a certain amount of respite, either a dollar amount for camp, something like that, it just needs to make sure that prior to sending that's reviewed. Same with CDS. There's some caps on the daily limits for CDS. So people should be aware of those and make sure it conforms to the guidelines. Again, otherwise we'll send back with questions. Next slide. Please include any backup documentation for that specific service. We're going to be sending out additional guidance around backup documentation because for some services, we're required to have things such as background checks. So support workers are familiar with that, with providing the results of a background check and their certification. But we're also required to collect that for some CES and personal supports vendors. For example, for the staff that are actually providing those services, and some other training documentation and stuff like that. So we're gonna be in the next couple of weeks, hopefully posting more robust list of documentation to include. But in general, for now, I'll just make sure that everything that's in there is included. For submitting we recommend people submit invoices directly, if possible, to that FMS vendor email address rather than going through support brokers. You can go through support brokers, that's not a problem. It's just that we've run into issues with vendors reaching out and not being totally clear on who on the team was supposed to be sending something to us. And so sometimes we find that we have not received things because they're passing through multiple parties. And so as much as possible, having a direct line so that you're sure that something gets sent would be advisable. But again, I know a lot of people depend on support brokers, to be more involved with invoice submission or timesheets or whatever, and that's fine. It's just that it creates extra layers in there when we're trying to unpack why someone didn't get paid. Next slide. Please do not use the Zendesk, the ticketing system, for initial invoice submission. I think people are confused about that. I think there's been rumors about people that you should send it that way. We're going to stop accepting those because it doesn't allow us to follow the standard process, for that team that does that, and it takes the people who initially, or there's a group of people who also work on customer service issues and tickets, and they're getting sidetracked with just moving over invoices for processing. So, use the FMS vendor at the arcccr.org email address to submit initial submissions. Then if you have a customer service issue, if it's been beyond the time indicated on the payables calendar and someone did get paid, you can use the customer service ticketing system to ask a question or follow up on something that's overdue. But for initial submissions, don't do them as a ticket. Also, please do not contact specific ARC employees directly unless one of them asks you to. It's not, the reason for that is because it's a very large department. There's lots of people. As we've grown, I know a lot of participants who have been with us for a long time or their teams are familiar with, individual staff members, and they try to reach out to them. But we've run into issues where if that staff is on vacation or if they've left the ARC or something like that, something might be sitting in an inbox and go unnoticed for a while. And so it's best to go through the generic inboxes, the FMS vendor, so that it's being, looked at and tracked by the whole team. Now, sometimes, a member of the accounts payable team will reach out to get follow-up documentation or ask questions. And it's, obviously it's fine to respond to them, or if they ask you to copy them on something, if you're going to directly, even if you're sending it to the vendor box, that's fine. It's just that we don't want people getting disappointed if, a specific person isn't responding to them. It tends to confuse things when we include specific people. And we try to standardize things. Next. So this is the accounts payable calendar. Just encourage people to be mindful of this, and that's really, if you didn't get a payment or you think a payment's overdue, that would be the first place you want to check, just to make sure that that prior to whatever date, and then that you've the check date has passed. And sometimes people get confused and they'll send something and 3 days later be following up or whatever, and it hasn't gone through the whole process. So just please be mindful of that. And we encourage people to put reminders on their calendar if you're responsible for processing those or helping out with that process. There are different schedules for different kinds of payments. So there's accounts payable, and then there's also the mileage reimbursement. Again, that's a monthly process. It has a different calendar, and then there's a payroll calendar, and that's bi-weekly payroll. So just keep that in mind too, because particularly the AP, the accounts payable and payroll calendars look very similar in style or whatever. So, just make sure that you're looking at the correct one to determine if something's overdue. Next slide. There's the mileage calendar. Same kind of thing. It looks similar, but just be mindful of which one you're looking at. Next slide. So all documents can be found on our website. I think most people are familiar with that. You can find the accounts payable calendars, the vendor payment requests, mileage forms, all that stuff. So we encourage people to go there first to check for those resources. And there's some, boxes you click to drop down, and it shows other forms underneath. So that we try to post everything and keep that up to date as much as possible. So you should be able to find the newest forms and stuff there. In terms of the vendor payment request, one thing to note is that I forgot to mention this earlier, but DDA has said in their guidance that a vendor payment request form itself isn't required, and that's true. But the information that that DDA has said that they need is essentially the same information. So it still needs to be signed by the participant or an authorized representative. If you were just going to send an invoice without a vendor payment request, we would need to know the exact service to tie to the budget line, signed by the participant, and the other information, the exact information about the vendor and all that stuff. So if all of that is on an invoice, technically it can be processed. But the vendor payment request form is just a helpful way to remember exactly what needs to be included. Next slide, please. So these are just all the ways you can reach out to the team, the 800 number, customer service tickets, and then the submission email addresses. So, either way is fine. There's been a lot of talk about the customer service ticketing system. Part of the reason for that is that it allows us to make sure we're getting questions and stuff to the right team, and then also holds us accountable internally because we're monitoring to make sure that the tickets are being addressed. We track them and see how long they are outstanding and that kind of stuff. And so it's a helpful system. It's also, we're required to report on that stuff to the Developmental Disabilities Administration. So we want to make sure that all the customer service requests and stuff are flowing through that system. But it also allows us to balance the workload so we can make sure that tickets are addressed as quickly as possible amongst all the people who are answering tickets. So next slide. The questions. I'm just going to roll through these and read them myself. So someone asked about posting the PowerPoint presentation. So yeah, we're going to post the presentation and a recording of the webinar on our website once we get it downloaded and everything. Do I have to send a current driver's license and current auto insurance every month? You do not need to send it every month as long as it's the one that you had sent was current. We do keep those on file. I know, there's been, I've seen complaints about that where somehow they're not getting saved or whatever, and I apologize for that. We're, trying to do a better job of making sure we're storing those. We actually store them in the bill system, so when they're processing that, they can check and make sure. But as long as the insurance is still current, that would be the only issue, because we do put the end date of the insurance, and most insurance is on a 6-month cycle, so just be mindful of that. But if we have it, we should be able to process. For Medicare reimbursement for the employee, it's being taken out of Social Security, what documentation is needed to get monthly reimbursement, since there's not an actual bill? We would need more guidance from DDA on that, actually, because we've had discussions with them about what is approved for. The idea is that someone would purchase a health plan, much like an employer would provide insurance, but for people that have other employee benefits. So for instance, if someone has another job and they pay an employee share, our understanding is that the medical benefits for self-direction are not used to pay that employee share with another employer. And I think so I would want to get guidance from DDA on that. I'll ask them, and they had talked about releasing some updated guidance, so I'll make sure that that's the kind of thing that they include. So someone's asking about saying that we haven't been following these timelines all the time, and just what we're doing to improve our process. So we've added a lot more team members to this. We've restructured the team to try to better to process things more quickly. And so we've been making a lot of improvements internally, and like I said, we're tracking that and trying to get a handle on that, and we're also tracking the dates that we receive invoices and everything in a different way now to hopefully get better insight into that. So and we report out on that to DDA as well. Someone's asked about the mileage form in Excel format. I'll see if we can do that. I don't know if there's a reason we can't put that up there in Excel format. Can you send a vendor payment request form without an invoice attached for support broker services? So I believe for support broker services, because we need you might be able to, as long as it has the exact dates and everything of service, and the VPR isn't typically that long. So I think it depends. I know a lot of vendors tend to send the itemized because we need the actual dates and hours of service. But I guess if you could cram that all onto a vendor payment request form, then that wouldn't be a problem. Someone asked if we send a vendor payment request, the invoice itself does not have to be signed. So, right, so the vendor payment request would be signed by the participant or authorized representative authorizing it. So the invoice wouldn't be signed, I don't believe. And I would encourage, so Anira and Kevin from our accounts payable team are on this as well. And I'm sure if I say anything wrong, I encourage them to jump in, but
yes, Matt, that's correct. So if the vendor, we aren't turning away the vendor request form, but we can just accept the invoice only if it has all of those elements that are on the vendor request form. So we would still be looking for those those like employer names, the vendor business name, mailing address, all of those components need to be on the invoice itself. Definitely signatures from the employer and authorized representative, service codes, dates. You're just transferring all of that information to your invoice if you're just submitting that to be processed.
Thanks. There's a question about letters of intent for camp funding. Anira, do you know if I'm actually not familiar with the process of how we provide those or if we provide those. I know we've been asked to prepay for some camps, but I'm not sure about letters of intent.
Usually the letters of intent are given to us. We just make sure that the funds are in the participants' budget for respite camp. And we sign off just saying that those funds are available. So it's not anything that we provide as far as a letter of intent. We usually receive that from either the participant or their teams requesting our signatures.
Yes, and what I would just add to that is when submitting letters of intent for camp funding, make sure that with the letter of intent, you've filled out all the necessary information for payment, just like a normal vendor payment request. So you should send the letter of intent and signed authorization from the participant, just so we know that this is an approved expense, and then can sign the letter of intent so you can return it to the camp.
Great, thank you. Someone asked if there is a problem with a reimbursement request, how will they know? So that first review team should be responding back to people and letting them know, if there's missing documentation or some other element of it that needs clarification. Someone asked what the current mileage rate is. The ARC doesn't establish that. That's established by the participant, and I believe DEA may have guidance on whether it can go beyond the federal rate. But that would, if there's a cap on that, it would be included in DDA's guidance, not from the ARC. Someone asked if a individual and family directed goods and service line item is in an approved budget. Do we still need to fill out DDA's approval electronically? I don't believe so. Someone please correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding was that if it's in the budget, then it doesn't need to be resubmitted through DDA's process.
Yes, that's correct. As long as it's in the budget, we don't need DDA's approval.
Okay, great, thank you. Do I have to send screenshots of my credit card and bank statements to show proof of payment? You would not, if you have a receipt for a purchase, you would not need to have a credit card and bank statements. Sometimes people fall back on those if they aren't able to provide a receipt, depending on the transaction. So I did like some transactions that are on, like a gym membership that has a auto renewal on a credit card, then they would normally send a statement as a proof of payment for that. But otherwise, you could just show a receipt for the transaction. Why can't a support broker send their own vendor sheet after the employer has already signed it? If the employer signs it, then I believe we do accept invoices from support brokers. DDA had changed that and then gone back on that a while back. So I don't know if that's what you're referring to, but they should be able to. I'm shocked that the ARC would recommend excluding support brokers from assisting with vendor payment requests. I guess all I'm saying with that is that we've seen a number of issues where sending vendor payment requests through support brokers has also resulted in issues. So it's a two-way street. All I'm saying is just sending it directly is preferred or tends to work out, but or at least making sure you're copied or whatever, because we hear from a lot of people who aren't exactly sure. They don't have the backup to prove, that it was sent or who did that or whatever, and it creates confusion. And so I think just being sure that something was sent before reaching out would be preferable. But again, I know a lot of support brokers do assist people with, a lot of that stuff, and that's totally fine. It's not that we, don't reject things for that or whatever, but we just want to, if you can do it and send it directly, that's probably better. You use the direct deposit form for services the family pays for like Uber rides. The direct deposit form, I guess, if you're talking about the request form, the vendor payment request form, then you could use that form for reimbursements for something like that. If that was the question. Does approval of a vendor, like an independent contractor, need approval from DDA first for a self-directed participant for a service that is non-licensed, like personal supports? Or does the ARC monitor or vet new vendors like CPR, first aid certs, and background checks? Yes, sorry, the last part, yes. The DDA does not vet them or approve them. For unlicensed, for non-licensed personal supports, so essentially a personal supports vendors, because most of them are not also licensed providers, although a lot of people do use licensed DDA providers as vendors. The ARC will be releasing those standards shortly, but going forward, we'll need to confirm CPR and first aid certification for staff and background checks. So we won't be running them, and there won't be a pre-approval process, but they'll need to provide that in order for the invoice to be paid. Is the process for that. We're trying to eliminate barriers to having a multi-step. So we don't have a multi-step process where people have to get vetted and approved and everything first and then submit invoices. You can still submit all the documentation at the same time as an invoice if it's your first time submitting an invoice. And then all that information will be stored, and you wouldn't need to submit it each time. You provide an example of an acceptable invoice for support worker services. What is listed online does not reflect what AP is saying is acceptable. I don't have an example of that. I would say though that DEA has a lot of guidance around the support broker piece, so we would just be trying to follow that. So if you get an answer from accounts payable that doesn't seem to match the DEA guidance on what should be included with a support broker invoice, then please reach out to the ticketing system, and we can get clarification on that. Or if if there's a team member who maybe doesn't have the most updated information, we'll make sure we get that taken care of. How long does it take to process a new support broker invoice with onboarding documents? As long as all of the documents are included, it shouldn't take it. It should fall within the standard accounts payable process. So it shouldn't. We're not certifying support brokers anymore. Some people are still trying to send support broker information to get them sort of cleared as a vendor, and we don't require that. If all the documentation, if it's the first time submitting it, and they have all the documentation included, they don't need to be cleared. That would be processed based on having everything approved. Are vendors permitted to submit FPRs with accompanying invoices for the participant without the signature from the participant or authorized representative? No. A vendor cannot submit an MPR, a VPR, without the signature from the participant or an authorized representative. We wouldn't pay those. We still need to. There is confusion about that, and sometimes vendors send things directly, but we still need to touch base with the participant and their team and get either a signed VPR or get that invoice signed and have the appropriate information on it. Do self-directed participants need to revise their PCP to switch a line item from direct staff to vendor staff? For example, personal sports or respite care, if they are already approved or budgeted, but find someone who wants to work as a vendor. Yes, you would need to do another budget sheet and budget mod to create a line for a vendor line. So they're all different in the system, and so that's one of those things that the accounts payable team would be looking for, because they can't apply a vendor invoice to a wage line in our system. Essentially, there's sort of two types of budget lines, and so that would require a budget mod. For medical copays, what form do you use to submit with the receipts for the ARC? You would use the vendor payment request form for that. And there's a question about what is the administrative assistant code, and I think what you're probably referring to is day-to-day administration, and that if you note clearly that that's what it's for, then that will get applied to that budget line. Is there any plan to have a web-based trackable system for this instead of using email? Yes, we do. In the future, we plan to, we still need to do some testing on it, but our hope is to use the bill system to actually like for submission, because we can track, you can submit documents in there, and we then will have total transparency for the whole process. So that is our plan. We just need to do some additional testing to make sure we can set that up to meet those needs. An environmental modification requiring construction, summary vendors require a portion of the money up front, additional money mid-project, and the remainder on completion. Can this be done through the system? So yes, we are currently doing that. We're talking with DDA about how they want those dated and everything on their end, because it's a billing issue, but we do pay upfront for those kinds of expenses as needed. What is the turnover time or process for participants to see the process vendor invoices on their participant dashboard? We're gonna start in the participant dashboard, you see the totals, and then we're gonna start creating reports, I think on a bi-weekly basis, so that people can see all the transaction details from that period. That should start in the next probably a couple weeks, but we will release information about that when we kick off that process. Because at this point, the participant dashboards are largely accurate for most people. There's a few transactions that might not be in there from some older stuff that we're adding, but everything should be up to date. Do all personal sport vendors have to be approved under DDA? What if the vendor under another license agency? If the vendor is under another license agency, will FMCS vet that information? So we would be treating all vendors the same. So if the vendor is a licensed at this point, and so if the vendor is a licensed DDA agency, we would still be asking for that information. We've talked with DDA about, some clarification around that, if they could circumvent that process. And so if a DDA vendor or DDA provider is providing the service, that we wouldn't have to vet them. But at this point, our understanding is that we need to have all that backup documentation, regardless of the type of vendor. All right, so I believe that is all of our questions. I will give, we tried to consolidate. I apologize if I didn't read every question. We consolidated some of them. Peter, our director of stakeholder relations, was looking through and making sure that they, that if there were questions that were similar or whatever, they were getting combined. So I'll give a few more minutes. All right, so if a participant has a budget line for something like a computer or electronic that they need for supports, is it possible to get the funding and submit a receipt for purchase? Not everyone can pay up front. We don't have a method to do that, to like reimburse someone for a purchase that hasn't happened at this point. Vanir or Kevin, unless I'm wrong, if there's, maybe if we cut a check directly to a vendor or something, but.
Yeah, that's what I would think. Sorry, go ahead, Vanir.
No, I was going to say it would have to be done through the reimbursement process. So we would need the person to pay, complete the actual purchase, and then we would be able to reimburse. They would just have to provide proof of purchase and proof of payment. And also the budget has to be there for the individual. There isn't a way to pay like Amazon directly or any other company directly for purchase, unfortunately.
Someone asked, please clarify what is needed for a self-directed participant to hire a vendor for CDS or personal sports. So for one, the person needs to have that vendor line in their budget. Then they would engage with the vendor would send in, send them an invoice, and it would be sent in with a VPR or without, if it had the right information. And that relationship between hiring that vendor is between the participant and the vendor. And then documentation needed. So we would need to know, which staff actually provided the service. And then again, in the future, we'll be requiring a background check and CPR. So the results of a background check and CPR and first aid certification for the staff that actually provided the service, the staff of the vendor that actually provided the service. So they wouldn't be a staff of the participant, but they would just be the information would need to be there. And again, we're gonna send out a list of those qualifications. Someone said they submitted a new vendor packet on November 1st and still not approved. I don't know what that would be, so I apologize. I would reach out through a ticket, because if you have a vendor invoice or you haven't engaged a vendor yet, you could engage the vendor and sign a contract with them and then send a vendor invoice, and then we would let you know if additional information was needed to support that invoice. But there's not an approval process for a vendor, if I'm understanding that correctly. Sorry, do we need to submit new W-9s every time for established support broker? I don't believe if someone, if it's a support broker we already have paid before, that's necessary. We may ask for one if we happen to not have it on file or can't find or something like that, but if they go to check for it, but you would typically not need to resubmit a W-9.
Yes, and that's true for the support broker certificates and CPR certificates as well. If those are up to date, you don't need to submit those every time.
So someone's clarified new vendors need a CPR, first aid, background checks, and W-9 for non-licensed services. Essentially, yes, that will be the requirement for that, but we'll send out detailed instructions for that. Someone asked if a mileage deadline is missed, can the request still be submitted later, and is there a final deadline? If it's not submitted by the deadline, we can't guarantee payment on that schedule, but I think it would get included just on another batch. I don't know that it would. I don't think it would actually wait. You wouldn't have to wait an entire month.
Right,
but
correct.
No.
Okay, cool. Yeah, there's just no guarantee that it's in that mileage batch. So subcontracted workers of vendors need to submit the supporting documentation to the ARC to have on file. Yes, the subcontracted workers of a vendor will. They don't need to submit it. Someone needs to submit it for them. So typically, but yes, I mean, it is the information for those subcontracted workers of vendors that we would need that information for. Whoever provides that, it doesn't matter whether it comes from the vendor, the subcontracted worker, or the participant happens to get it from them, but it would need to be with that invoice for process. Are brokers required to do a CPS background check? I believe they are if they're working with someone who's under 18 years old. And that's true, I think, of all TDA services. Someone's asking with the new vendor requirement of teams need to submit a family of staff form. If a vendor hires a family member, we would need to ask DDA about how they want that handled. And will they need to add a support broker to the team? Yeah, I mean, so our understanding of DDA's guidance is that, well, I don't know what the timeline is for DDA implementing that, but that support brokers are the people who have family of staff are required to have a support broker involved. I think that has not been fully nailed down yet. Are you tracking DDA sole practitioner approvals of vendors such as nurses and behavior specialists? We're working with DDA on how to get those lists from them, so we would not need all the documentation for someone that is a DDA approved vendor for those things. Much like the other DDA approved vendors, it doesn't seem it seems like we shouldn't have to get those, so we're working with DDA on how we would, how they want us to handle that. Someone asked for a reimbursement. Do you have to submit a W-9? Technically, no, but I think normally our team asks for it because they need that information to build the profile. It's just easier than having separate forms like a W-9 and then a form that essentially has the same fields for the same exact information that's not a W-9. It doesn't mean though that if you submit a W-9 that we will submit it for, that will, you know, issue a 1099. It just depends on whether it's taxable or not. Is there a cutoff for submitting VPRs based on the participant's plan year or fiscal year? We can't bill for anything more than a year old at any given point, and that's including our processing time. So typically we would have to reach out to DEA if something was over 11 months old, to give us time to process and bill for it. I believe that we worked with DEA on extending our cutoff. I'll have to check with our CFO to confirm that, but past the fiscal year piece, but someone said their respite care staff drives very little, essentially, you know, a few miles a month. Could they submit the mileage on one form? I don't think it would be a problem if you submitted several months on one form. Correct me if I'm wrong here, but it's more that they're willing to just go that long without payment, but that would be fine.
This question is asking to combine multiple months.
Yeah, they only drive like say 10 miles a month, so they just hold off for like a quarter and put it all in one. Is that okay?
No, I would submit it each month, as a monthly reimbursement for mileage.
Okay. What docs do you need for a new day-to-day administrator to be hired? It's already in the budget. I think again, if there's specific things we need for like a backup documentation, when we send out the guidance on that, that'll be included. But otherwise, there's no like pre-approval for that or whatever. But we'll provide clarification on that. Someone said they thought respite care didn't include mileage payments, only personal support. Off the top of my head, I don't know the answer to that. So let me, I need to get further clarification before I say that, because that might be accurate. I think it depends also on the type of respite. Like if it's a respite staff doing hourly, that would be different, obviously, than if you're paying a vendor for daily respite or a camp. Right. There's some other questions that weren't about accounts payable, so we'll you know, like I said, we'll be having other webinars on other topics in the future, so stay tuned for those. What is the process for direct deposit for a family that pays for services? So if a family is, if I understand correctly, a family is paying for services from a vendor, then you would still have a vendor invoice, and I guess you would just need to make it clear who's getting paid for those. I don't know if you're talking about just paying out of pocket for a service. I think it would need to be, we need more clarification on that situation. I don't want to like tell you that that's okay or something. So let me be clear. I'm getting comments of people complaining that we don't pay invoices and people thanking us for things getting better. So I'll just roll those all into one thing. thank you / we're sorry. I know, we did have a glut of invoices that were behind several months ago, and we're working through those. And we're worked through those. And I will say too that we do want to get that electronic submission process we talked about earlier, to get a bit more insight into the process for people. So we are working on that. And like I said, we've added members to the team. I would still encourage people to reach out through the ticketing system if they believe there's something that's, not paid or whatever, because there's times where people come forward and there's invoices that we have never seen, they haven't been sent to us for whatever reason. It's also possible, I mean, we do lose things. I'm not saying we're perfect, but or there's humans involved in this process, and so there's always a possibility of human error, but we do try to narrow down what broke in our system and what we can, system meaning the entire process, not just the electronic systems, and how we can improve that and get to the source of if something goes missing in a process, how can we improve that? So that's why we often ask for if someone puts in a ticket, that they didn't get paid or whatever, we ask them to send the original email if possible, so we can try to figure out what was happening at that time in our process and who may have been handling that, those kinds of things, to see if we can get to the bottom of that. Someone asked if we're able to get a receive notification when we submit VPRs. Is there an auto receipt thing on that mailbox, or?
There should be. Let me double check just to make sure. Yes, you should receive an automatic email reply when you submit to the vendor inbox that says, "Thank you for your submission."
So if you don't get an automatic reply, then that's a pretty good sign that something broke down that first part of getting that in there. So if you do get that though, then assume it's in process, and then if it doesn't hit the timeline, reach out. It's just we're again doing over 900 a week. We're trying to limit the steps our staff take to try to get as many processes quickly as possible, and then implement a different system to get better transparency rather than more interaction with the processing staff, because that tends to just jam things up. It also jams up that mailbox if there's more communication with it that isn't related to like an actual invoice being attached to an email to submit. That's the other reason to use the customer service system, because if you just email that mailbox, it gets mixed in with all the invoice submissions rather than going to the customer service team. Someone's asking about respite camp and transportation. If the camp offers transportation for a fee, can that be paid through the respite line? That would be a DDA question. I'm not totally sure how they'd want that answered, or whether that would be a transportation line or something. Someone asked if new background checks need to be submitted for vendors if they're already on file for an SDS participant as a direct worker. So no, but I wouldn't count on us the people who process the accounts payable for that aren't going to inherently know that background. They're not going to search our system or whatever. They wouldn't know that person is also a direct worker for the SDS participant. So I would if you're going to do that, I would at least say, a background check should already be on file, because they're a direct worker, something like that, to alert them to know that. I wouldn't count on that, because it doesn't get it. The documentation that's attached in the bill system for vendor payments is a different system from the payroll systems and stuff like that. Someone said they really need to know what the turnaround time is for reimbursement. That would be the AP calendar. Someone said they pay for Uber and get a check each month. They want to get direct deposit. If you want to get direct deposit, like I said earlier, just put in a ticket to request that your direct deposit information be added. If you're not an employee, we don't have the direct deposit information, so they'll send you a form to get the direct deposit, like the bank information. If a participant needs backup staff through an agency because their regular staff's on vacation, what's the best way to handle this? when submitting a budget modification, what would the item fall under on the budget? So that you would do, if the staff say was personal supports, you would do you'd want to do a budget mod to add, and a budget sheet to add funding to the, vendor line, a personal supports vendor line. And so that's where that would fall. And then we could process invoices for service done through a vendor. Someone sent an invoice, they haven't received it. So you would check the AP calendar to ensure that, that you should have received the payment, and then you would do a Zendesk ticket to follow up on that. Someone said, are we monitored on how many tickets we are supposed to open? Our support worker said we shouldn't book the tickets and they should do it for us. Otherwise, it counts against the number of tickets we're allowed. There's no limit on the number of tickets you're allowed to open. And so, yeah, and in fact, I mean, it is probably preferred that you submit one ticket for one issue. So if, because sometimes people will send an email with a litany of things and it's hard to deconstruct that. And so particularly sometimes if, for instance, a support broker works with multiple participants, and so they're using one ticket to address multiple, issues with multiple participants, potentially different departments. So if you have a payroll issue, that's different than the accounts payable team, so we break them apart in our system and send them to the correct team members to address that. But if you have a ticket that you try to submit a ticket that crosses too many areas. Now, if it's, an accounts payable ticket that becomes a budget mod issue, then it gets sent over to that team to deal with or whatever. We do send them to each other, but it's easier to have one ticket per issue so that it can be addressed. But there is no limit on how many tickets either a support broker or participant can open. Someone's asking about administrative assistant. That again, I think it's day-to-day admin. When you go over 40 hours, if the staff member is using a different code, or is it just all 40 and no overtime? So you can only receive the DDA limit on the number of day-to-day administrative hours in a week. My understanding is a staff member could do that in a different service and then could work more hours. But if for anything more complicated than that, I'd want to check with DDA for guidance on that. Okay, so I think that is the end of the questions. Like I said, there's someone asked, the dashboard does not reflect any filed invoices and why. The dashboard just shows a total of the activity. There's reports in there that they get created on the back end for a certain time span. When you have those reports, then you can look at the detail, which was, I assume, what you would be referring to with the filed invoice. So we will be loading those shortly and come out with guidance in the next, I'd say, couple of weeks on that. Someone asks about, what are we doing to increase response time? Again, sometimes it takes days before hearing back. We've added resources to that. We do our own internal reporting on that and following up with team members and following up on the age of tickets and stuff like that. I think the average ticket response, I think, is a few days. But I will say it depends on the complexity of the ticket, and then also the whether we're waiting on a response from any team member or whatever. So it also depends on the cycle of, so a payroll ticket submitted, on payroll Friday, we put extra resources on payroll, and that team typically works through the weekends to address that, as an example. But those, because those tickets all tend to come at the same time every 2 weeks, then it might take a little longer to get around to sending back a response on those. You might not hear by the end of the day, I guess I'm saying. But otherwise, I guess we have internal processes to be tracking that stuff and be following up on those tickets. All right. I see two people with their hands up, but I don't think everyone's muted, and I don't know that we have a way to deal with that, so I apologize for that, but I think we can go through the Q&As on our own, or sorry, we can download it and check to make sure if there was any questions that need someone to reach out directly or whatever, our team can reach out and follow up. But again, I would encourage anyone, I saw some questions where people didn't seem like they maybe not put through a ticket. So I'd encourage anyone to, put in a ticket with any question or any issue. It doesn't have to be a problem. If you just have a general question about how the system works or something like that, you can do that as well. Because that's the best way to get it to the right team. Someone said their dashboard report is incorrect. If you believe your participant dashboard is incorrect, please do a ticket for that. I mean, send it to the financial reporting team to investigate with says the budget wasn't potentially pulled over last year, so we pulled in when we went live with the EVI system, we pulled in activity prior to that, so the end of last calendar year. And so if you believe those amounts weren't correct or whatever, again, reach out. Or if the budget lines don't seem correct to you, like you think you've submitted budget mods that don't appear to have been processed, again, put a ticket in for that. Someone asked where to send the ticket. If you look at our accounts, well, if you go to our website, I think it's at the bottom. Peter, if you could go back a slide or two. And then someone asked about getting access to the budgets in real time for support brokers. We're currently getting CCSs into the system, and that was the plan. As like we worked with DDA on that. So once all the CCSs get active in the system, then we will start allowing people to request support broker access. That will probably not happen for a couple months, and we will send an email about that when we're done with the CCSs, essentially. For self-directed participants, they rely on their CCS to complete budget modification. This can result in employee retention problems. Are these budget modifications viewable to participants so they can check on the status of issues? So once they've been submitted, they're not viewable. I think if I'm understanding the question correctly, a participant should be seeing a budget modification before it gets sent, or should be aware of it or whatever. But if you're talking about in our system, that's still a pretty analog process. So the budget modifications get logged and then uploaded. I will say we do, there's a little bit of a triage there for budget modification issues that are resulting in non-payment. So we try to get those processed as quickly as possible to get the payroll out the door. If there are budget modifications that are more sort of general to prepare for things, then those might take a week or so to process. But there's no way for us to sort of show that, to track that in process for someone. They're all internal sheets, I guess I would say. Our new budget sheets require when a budget mod is completed. Increasingly they are, because the budget sheet is what is used essentially. Personally, I think we should submit a budget sheet with a budget mod. It won't be obvious to us because you can't just mod money in most circumstances. And so we'd still need to know exactly how to break that down and what the calculation was for that, because DDA, because people can't exceed the number of hours they're authorized for. And we need a budget sheet to determine that that's not what someone's trying to do with a budget mod. So most of the time with a budget mod, it will probably ask for a budget sheet. Someone said their spending report in the dashboard has not been updated since August. Yeah, we have to trigger those to run on the back end, either on an individual basis or across the board. So like I said, we will get into a schedule of doing those bi-weekly, but we haven't started that yet. So which will probably just run like a year-to-date for everyone, and then they'll be running a bi-weekly schedule, but those aren't they're not an automatic report, so that's not like a problem with the system. So before, I know we're at time, and I'll cut us off in 1 second. Someone asked about an employee change form. They still get sent to FMS employee updates, they don't get sent to Zendesk. Normally Zendesk would not be the initial way to send anything. It would be a customer service issue. All right, so I want to be respectful of everyone's time. We're a couple minutes over, but I want to thank everyone for attending. If you have other questions, again, I would submit a customer service ticket, and we'll go through these questions and see if there's anything we can add to our frequently asked question documents. We'll be doing more webinars, informational, and then also, so a lot of these questions also help us inform, what written guidance we need to either update or provide, and so we'll incorporate that as much as possible. So thank you all for your time, and thanks for choosing the ARC, and have a nice day.